Ladies and gentlemen, of course, let's start with 4 short key points for your topic. Key points. A woman over 40 has earned the wisdom to spot toxic patterns early. She no longer feels obligated to please everyone. She values her peace more than other people's approval. She confidently removes anyone who drains her spirit or disrespects her boundaries. Here's your motivational speech in Denzel Washington style, without headings. You get to a point in life when you realize that your time, your energy, your spirit, these things are priceless. A woman over 40 knows that better than anybody. She's been through enough to recognize who lifts her up and who only shows up to pull her down. And let me tell you, she doesn't tolerate those people anymore. She's not here to entertain the critics who always have something negative to say. She's not here to convince the doubters who never believed in her. She's not here to rescue the ones who refuse to change. She's not here to dance around the egos of the selfish or the manipulators who twist her kindness into weakness. No, she's done with all of that. Because when you walk through fire and come out stronger, you don't have to prove anything to anybody. You learn that your peace is non-negotiable. Your purpose is too important, and your heart deserves to be protected. So if you're that woman, if you're stepping into this season of your life, stand tall, be unapologetic about who you let in and who you show the door. Because you're not here to be weighed down by small minds or small hearts. You're here to rise, to grow, to love yourself enough to never settle for less than you deserve. Keep moving forward. Keep shining your light. Because the moment you decide you're no longer available for toxic people, that's the moment you claim your freedom. And that's how you win. A woman over 40 has earned the wisdom to spot toxic patterns early. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's simply because of the number of birthdays she celebrated. It is the result of countless experiences, some painful, some empowering, that have shaped her ability to see clearly what she once might have ignored. In her 20s, she may have excused poor treatment or made excuses for people who drained her energy. She may have thought she could change them or believe that love alone would be enough to heal someone else's wounds. Back then, she might have blamed herself when others acted carelessly or cruelly, wondering if she wasn't enough or if she could just try harder to win their respect. But by the time she reaches her 40s, she has seen enough repeated patterns to recognize when someone's words don't match their actions. She notices when a person showers her with affection in public but criticizes her in private. She catches the subtle signs of manipulation, like guilt-tripping, passive-aggressive comments, or the quiet withdrawal of support when she dares to set a boundary. She doesn't have to wait months or years to confirm what her instincts already tell her. Experience has sharpened her intuition, and she knows how to trust it. She can recall moments from her past when she stayed in friendships or relationships that chipped away at her confidence. She remembers the way it felt to pretend everything was fine just to keep the peace. She has spent enough nights replaying conversations in her head, trying to understand why she felt so small around certain people. All of those lessons were not wasted. They were preparing her to step into this phase of life where she can spot the red flags quickly and act on them without apology. Yeah! Her wisdom isn't just about recognizing toxic behaviors in others. It's also about understanding her own patterns, how she once tolerated disrespect because she was afraid of being alone, how she used to over-explain herself to people who never really listened, how she gave too many chances to those who only took advantage of her kindness. She has learned that compassion for others should never come at the cost of compassion for herself. She knows now that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away, even if it disappoints someone else. In her 40s, she has a clearer sense of what genuine connection feels like. She knows the difference between someone who shows up consistently and someone who only appears when they need something. She can spot the difference between constructive feedback and veiled criticism meant to undermine her confidence. When someone tries to gaslight her by questioning her perception of reality, she doesn't waver as she might have in the past. She has developed an unshakable understanding of her worth, and no one can convince her to see herself through their distorted lens. Years of navigating relationships have taught her that people who thrive on chaos will always resent her peace. She doesn't take it personally anymore when someone reacts badly to her boundaries. She has realized that it's not her responsibility to manage another person's discomfort. She can empathize with their struggles without inviting their dysfunction into her own life. She understands that love without respect is not real love, and loyalty without reciprocity is not true friendship. A woman over 40 has spent enough time compromising herself to know the cost of ignoring her intuition. She has watched her energy deplete when she tolerated chronic complainers or emotional vampires. She has felt the fatigue that comes from constantly trying to justify her decisions to people who don't genuinely care about her happiness. Now she can see the early signs of dismissive tone, the subtle contempt, the pattern of taking without giving. And she doesn't need to wait for more evidence to take action. She trusts the signals her body gives her when something is off, the tightening in her chest, the heaviness in her gut. Those signals are the wisdom she earned through experience. This woman knows that not every relationship is meant to last forever. She has made peace with the reality that growth sometimes means outgrowing people. She no longer romanticizes connections that drain her spirit. She has learned to appreciate what those relationships taught her without feeling obligated to maintain them out of guilt or nostalgia. Her past has given her clarity, and clarity has given her freedom. She also recognizes the subtle ways that toxicity can show up in professional environments. She has worked for bosses who demanded everything and offered nothing in return. She has been part of teams where gossip was disguised as camaraderie and competition was masked as ambition. Over time, she learned to identify the difference between constructive collaboration and environments that erode her confidence. She no longer confuses busyness with purpose or loud voices with authority. She listens for integrity and observes whether people act in alignment with their stated values. When she meets someone new, she doesn't rush to share every detail of her life. She has learned the value of discernment. Trust to her is something that is earned over time through consistency and honesty. She understands that real connection doesn't require her to abandon herself or ignore her own needs. She is no longer willing to twist herself into someone else's idea of who she should be. This woman knows that it's not her job to fix broken people or prove her worth to anyone. She has seen how people reveal themselves over time, and she believes them the first time they show her who they are. She doesn't need to be convinced by apologies that aren't backed by change. She doesn't get swept up in empty promises or declarations of love that lack follow through. She also knows that sometimes the most dangerous patterns are the quiet ones, the subtle put-downs that chip away at her confidence, the lack of enthusiasm for her accomplishments, the constant shifting of responsibility when conflicts arise. She notices when she feels smaller around someone, when she second guesses herself after spending time together. She has learned to pay attention to that feeling and honor it as the truth. A woman over 40 has learned that setting boundaries doesn't make her unkind or selfish. It makes her wise. She no longer feels the need to explain her decisions to people who have proven themselves untrustworthy. She understands that anyone who truly respects her won't require endless justifications for why she needs space or why she chooses to step away. With every experience, every heartbreak, every disappointment, every triumph, she has refined her ability to see clearly. She no longer projects her potential onto others or hopes that love will transform dysfunction into something healthy. She sees people as they are, not as she wishes they would be. And that clarity allows her to move through the world with a quiet confidence that can't be shaken. Her wisdom is hard-won and deeply rooted. She knows the difference between empathy and enabling. She understands that she can care about someone without making their problems her own. She has learned to love herself enough to walk away from situations that cost her peace. She trusts herself to make decisions that honor her values and protect her well-being. This woman's life experience has become her compass. She doesn't waste time doubting her perceptions or seeking validation from people who don't see her worth. She knows that the right people will respect her boundaries and celebrate her growth. And she has learned that sometimes the most loving thing she can do is let go of what no longer serves her. She no longer feels obligated to please everyone. It took her years to understand that constantly putting other people's comfort ahead of her own was not a virtue, but a burden. She carried out a fear. Fear of being disliked, fear of being judged, fear of being alone. She remembers a time when she would twist herself into any shape necessary to avoid conflict, when she would soften her opinions so they wouldn't seem too strong or too different, when she would say yes, even as her entire body was screaming a no. For much of her life, she believed that her worth was measured by how agreeable she could be, how accommodating, how willing she was to sacrifice her own needs. The idea that she could simply exist without justification, that she didn't have to earn her place by overextending herself for others, was foreign to her. She could look back now and see the countless moments when she ignored her intuition because she didn't want to make waves. There were friendships that demanded her constant reassurance, where she became the sounding board, the caretaker, the one who always showed up to help but rarely received the same in return. She thought that being needed meant being valued, but over time she began to see that her willingness to overgive was not a sign of love. It was a symptom of her own insecurity. She worried that if she said no, if she set a limit, she would be perceived as cold or selfish. She couldn't bear the thought of someone being disappointed in her, so she kept smiling, kept nodding, kept agreeing to things she didn't have the time or energy for. In her work, she carried the same compulsion to please. She took on extra tasks without complaint because she didn't want to seem unhelpful. She stayed late to finish projects while others left early, believing that her value depended on proving she was indispensable. When her colleagues made unreasonable demands, she convinced herself it was easier to comply than to advocate for herself. Even when she was exhausted, she would say, "Of course, I don't mind," though inside she resented the expectation that she would always be available. She thought that by being agreeable, she would earn respect and security, but all she earned was more demand. In her relationships, she tolerated thoughtlessness because she feared confrontation. If a partner dismissed her feelings or took her for granted, she rationalized their behavior, telling herself that nobody was perfect and that she should be more understanding. She minimized her own hurt to avoid seeming needy or high maintenance. She learned to swallow her disappointment and pretend everything was fine just to keep the peace. But the peace was only surface deep, because inside she felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller with every unspoken truth. She remembers times when she said, "I'm fine," when she absolutely wasn't. When she said, "It's okay," even though it wasn't. When she said, "no problem," while her spirit felt crushed under the weight of too many compromises. She did this so often that she forgot what her own needs even were. Her identity became entangled with her role as the peacemaker, the fixer, the one who absorbed everyone else's discomfort so they wouldn't have to face it themselves. There were moments she caught glimpses of her own resentment, like smoke rising from a fire she refused to acknowledge. She noticed how tired she felt after interactions where she had to perform a version of herself that others found more palatable. She noticed the tightness in her chest when someone asked her for something she didn't want to give, and she said yes anyway. She began to see how this pattern of people-pleasing left her feeling disconnected not only from others but from her own sense of self. Over time, she started to question where this need to please everyone had come from. She thought about her upbringing, the way she learned to be the good girl, to anticipate everyone's needs before her own. She thought about the messages she absorbed from a culture that rewards women for being agreeable and punishes them for being assertive. She remembered the time she was praised for being easygoing, for going along with whatever others wanted. Those small rewards shaped her understanding of what it meant to be worthy of love and belonging. But experience has a way of challenging old beliefs. With every disappointment, every moment when she felt invisible, she began to wonder what might happen if she stopped trying so hard to keep everyone else comfortable. She started to experiment with saying what she actually felt. At first, it felt terrifying. Her voice trembled when she said, "No, I can't help you with that." Her heart raced when she said, "Actually, that doesn't work for me." She waited for the backlash she was certain would come. Sometimes it did. People who were used to her compliance didn't appreciate her boundaries. But what surprised her was how often the world didn't end. How often people simply accepted her answer and moved on. The more she practiced honoring her own needs, the stronger she felt. She realized that every time she prioritized someone else's comfort over her own truth, she was betraying herself. She began to understand that genuine relationships don't require constant accommodation. True connection is built on honesty and mutual respect, not on one person's willingness to abandon themselves to avoid conflict. She noticed how her relationships began to shift. Some people quietly drifted away when she stopped being the ever-available caretaker. Some relationships fell apart entirely. And while that was painful, she also felt a sense of relief she hadn't expected. She was no longer willing to carry the weight of other people's expectations just to keep them close. She realized that if someone's love depended on her constant self-sacrifice, it wasn't love at all. It was conditional. She discovered that she had more energy when she stopped pouring it into situations that drained her. She felt lighter without the burden of trying to be everything to everyone. She learned that saying no didn't make her unkind. It made her honest. It made her real. And in being real, she began to attract relationships that felt more authentic, where she could be herself without fear of rejection. The freedom she feels now is not about being defiant or indifferent to others. She still cares deeply about the people in her life. She still shows up with compassion and generosity, but she no longer confuses self-abandonment with kindness. She no longer believes she has to be agreeable to be loved. She knows now that she can be thoughtful and firm at the same time, that she can set limits without apology, that her value is not measured by how much of herself she is willing to give away. When she reflects on the years she spent contorting herself to meet other people's expectations, she doesn't feel shame. She understands that she was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. But she also knows she will never go back to that version of herself. She has outgrown the need to be liked by everyone. She has outgrown the belief that harmony is worth the cost of her own well-being. She has learned to trust that she is enough exactly as she is, without needing to prove it by pleasing everyone she meets. Now, when someone tries to guilt her into doing something that doesn't feel right, she doesn't automatically fold. She takes a breath. She checks in with herself. She listens to her own needs before she responds. And if the answer is no, she says it with clarity and calm. She no longer feels the compulsion to soften her no with endless explanations or apologies. She trusts that her boundaries are valid even if others don't understand them. She has learned that it is not her responsibility to manage other people's feelings about her choices. This way of being has opened up space in her life, space for rest, for joy, for the pursuits that truly matter to her. She no longer spends her days reacting to everyone else's demands. She no longer lies awake at night replaying conversations, wondering if she should have done more to make someone else comfortable. She knows that she can care about people without sacrificing her own truth. She knows that her worth is not contingent on her ability to meet every expectation. She no longer feels obligated to please everyone because she finally understands that her life is hers to live. She values her peace more than other people's approval. There was a time when she couldn't imagine saying that out loud. She spent years convincing herself that the opinions of others were more important than the quiet voice inside her telling her what was right. She measured her worth by the reactions she got from people around her, whether they smiled, whether they nodded in agreement, whether they praised her for being easygoing and agreeable. She thought their approval would finally fill the emptiness she felt, that it would reassure her she was enough. So she worked tirelessly to keep everyone happy, believing that if she just did everything right, if she stayed agreeable and accommodating, she would never have to face criticism or rejection. But no matter how much she tried, it was never enough to silence the quiet ache inside her. No amount of praise or acceptance could erase the exhaustion that came from constantly putting other people's needs before her own. She would smile and nod in conversations where she disagreed, because she didn't want to offend anyone. She would say yes to commitments she didn't want, just to avoid disappointing others. Even in moments when she was overwhelmed and desperately needed rest, she felt compelled to show up for everyone else. She thought that was what it meant to be a good friend, a good partner, a good colleague. She thought sacrificing her own well-being was the price she had to pay for belonging. As she grew older, she began to recognize the cost of this way of living. She noticed the resentment that built up when she ignored her own needs for the sake of harmony. She felt the heaviness that settled in her chest after yet another conversation where she silenced herself rather than risk disagreement. She realized how drained she felt when she constantly sought validation from people whose approval was conditional and fleeting. Little by little, she began to see that no amount of acceptance from others could replace the peace that comes from being true to herself. She started to understand that peace wasn't something she would find by meeting everyone's expectations. It was something she could only cultivate by learning to honor her own voice. She began to notice the difference between the temporary relief of pleasing someone and the lasting steadiness that came from doing what felt right in her soul. When she finally started to say no to commitments that didn't serve her, she felt a strange mix of fear and freedom. She worried that people would think she was selfish, that they would walk away if she stopped bending over backward to please them. But she also felt a quiet relief, a sense of alignment she had been craving without even knowing it. As she practiced listening to herself, she discovered how much more energy she had when she wasn't constantly trying to manage other people's perceptions. She realized that seeking approval had kept her tethered to other people's moods and expectations, and that she had been living in reaction to their desires instead of creating a life that felt meaningful to her. She began to let go of the need to explain or justify her choices. She learned that she didn't have to convince anyone that her boundaries were reasonable or that her priorities were valid. The more she trusted herself, the more she understood that her peace was not negotiable. She began to feel at home in her own company in a way she never had before. She didn't need the constant reassurance that she was liked or accepted. She didn't need the external validation she had once craved to feel good about herself. Her sense of worth started to come from within, from knowing that she was showing up for herself in ways she never had when she was focused on pleasing everyone else. She learned to recognize when her desire for approval was steering her away from her own value. She could feel it in her body, a tightness in her chest, a restlessness in her thoughts, a nagging sense of self-betrayal. Those signals became her guideposts, reminding her that nothing was worth sacrificing her peace. Even in her professional life, she began to notice how often she had compromised her well-being to maintain an image of competence and likability. She would take on extra work because she didn't want anyone to think she wasn't capable. She would stay silent in meetings when she disagreed, worried that speaking up would make her look difficult. She would swallow her opinions to avoid criticism. But as she began to value her peace more, she realized that being true to herself mattered more than being seen as agreeable. She started to advocate for her ideas, to trust that her perspective was worth sharing, even if it made others uncomfortable. In her friendships and relationships, she stopped over-explaining her boundaries. She stopped apologizing for needing space or time alone. She noticed that the people who respected her didn't require her to abandon herself to prove her loyalty. They understood that her saying no wasn't a rejection of them, but an affirmation of her own well-being. And the people who took offense or tried to manipulate her with guilt revealed themselves as connection she no longer needed to maintain. She didn't feel the old urgency to smooth things over or make herself smaller to avoid someone else's discomfort. She trusted that she could withstand their disapproval. There was a time when she believed that if she disappointed someone, it meant she had failed in some way. But now she understands that disappointment is inevitable when you stop living your life to please others. She knows that it's not her responsibility to manage other people's reactions to her choices. She has learned to distinguish between genuine care and the subtle pressure to conform. When someone tries to question her decisions or make her feel guilty for prioritizing her own needs, she no longer feels the need to defend herself. She simply remembers that her peace is more important. She notices how much more content she feels when she is aligned with her own values. She doesn't wake up with the same dread she once felt, worrying about how to keep everyone happy. She doesn't replay conversations in her mind, analyzing every word to figure out if she upset someone. She has accepted that not everyone will like her, and that this is not a problem she has to solve. She understands that the people who matter will respect her even when she says no, and those who don't were never truly invested in her well-being. This commitment to valuing her peace over approval has also changed the way she shows up for others. She has more to give because she isn't depleted from constant self-sacrifice. She listens more deeply because she isn't distracted by the need to be seen as perfect. She is more present because she is no longer performing a version of herself she thinks others will find acceptable. She has discovered that real connection doesn't require her to abandon herself. In fact, it thrives when she is authentic and clear about who she is and what she needs. There are still moments when the old impulse to please shows up. She notices it when she's about to say yes out of habit, when she feels the familiar anxiety that she might let someone down. But now she has the awareness to pause and ask herself whether saying yes is worth the cost. She has learned that peace is not something she can create by making everyone else happy. It's something she cultivates by choosing integrity over approval again and again. She values her peace more than other people's approval because she knows how it feels to live without it. She remembers the exhaustion, the resentment, the quiet despair of a life spent trying to be what everyone else wanted. And she knows that no praise, no validation, no temporary acceptance is worth giving up the steadiness she has found in herself. She confidently removes anyone who drains her spirit or disrespects her boundaries. She did not always have this clarity or courage. For years, she tolerated relationships that left her feeling exhausted, diminished, and unseen because she believed it was her job to hold everything together. She told herself that if she could just be more understanding, more patient, more forgiving, eventually things would change. Eventually, the people who took her kindness for granted would wake up and realize her worth. But the more she gave without limits, the more she felt her own energy slipping away, replaced by resentment and a gnawing emptiness she could not name. It was in those quiet moments, late at night, when she lay awake replaying the same hurtful interactions, that she started to question why she kept allowing people to cross her boundaries. Why she ignored the tightness in her chest every time someone dismissed her feelings or made demands she could no longer meet. Why she explained herself over and over to people who had no interest in understanding her. She began to see that no matter how much she hoped, wished, or tried to prove herself, some people were simply committed to misunderstanding her or taking advantage of her willingness to give. There were friends who thrived on chaos, who came to her with every crisis but disappeared the moment she needed support in return. They drained her spirit with their endless complaints, their refusal to take responsibility for their lives, their expectation that she would always be the steady one who carried their burden. For a long time, she stayed in those friendships because she was afraid that letting go would make her look selfish or uncaring. But each time she hung up the phone feeling heavy and depleted, she knew she was paying too high a price for connection that was one-sided. She remembers the moment she realized that staying in these draining relationships was not an act of compassion, but a form of self-betrayal. She finally asked herself why she believed it was her role to rescue people who had no intention of changing. Why she felt obligated to be a constant source of comfort when it cost her her own peace. She started to understand that she was not helping anyone by pretending to be okay with being treated as an emotional dumping ground. She saw clearly for the first time that love without respect is not love at all. She also began to recognize how often people tested her boundaries, subtly or directly, to see if she would bend. There were colleagues who expected her to pick up their slack because they knew she wouldn't say no. There were family members who believed they were entitled to her time and energy simply because of shared blood, as though her needs were less important than their expectations. There were partners who thought that loving her meant controlling her, who tried to tell her who she should be and what she should feel. Each time she allowed her limits to be violated, she felt a little less like herself, a little less capable of trusting her own instincts. But over time, she grew tired of the cycle, tired of feeling like she had to earn respect she should have been given freely, tired of diminishing her own needs to avoid conflict, tired of carrying relationships that felt like obligations rather than choices. She started to imagine what her life would feel like if she were surrounded only by people who respected her boundaries and valued her presence. She began to understand that it was not cruel to walk away from what drained her. It was necessary. She learned to pay attention to the signals her body gave her when someone's energy was out of alignment with her own. the anxiety that fluttered in her stomach when she anticipated yet another unreasonable demand, the heaviness in her chest when she felt obligated to pretend she was okay with being disrespected, the exhaustion that settled over her after interactions where she had to perform rather than be herself. She began to trust those signals as evidence that something needed to change. She no longer waits for people to offer her the respect she deserves. She does not argue or plead with them to understand her boundaries. She simply enforces them. If someone tries to guilt her into abandoning herself, she recognizes it as manipulation and she disengages. If someone consistently ignores her limits, she takes it as proof of their priorities and she withdraws her energy. She doesn't waste time explaining the same boundary to the same person over and over, hoping they will finally see her point of view. She understands now that those who care about her will listen the first time. There are moments when this clarity feels like loss. She has had to grieve the friendships and connections she once thought were unbreakable. She has had to sit with the loneliness that comes in the space between letting go of what doesn't serve her and finding what does. But even in those moments of grief, she feels a deeper sense of peace because she knows she is no longer betraying herself. She is no longer pretending that disrespect is love or that constant depletion is normal. She has discovered that removing someone from her life does not require drama or resentment. It is simply a quiet decision to choose herself. To choose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, authenticity over performance. She does not need to vilify anyone in order to step away. She can recognize that some people are not meant to walk beside her and wish them well from a distance. The more she practices this, the more natural it becomes. What once felt terrifying now feels liberating. Each time she removes someone who drains her spirit or disrespects her boundaries, she feels herself growing stronger, more rooted in her own worth. She no longer second guesses whether she has the right to decide who gets access to her time, energy, and heart. She knows that she alone gets to make that decision. In her presence, there is a quiet confidence that others can sense. She no longer feels compelled to explain her choices or soften her truth. When someone asks why she no longer answers their calls or shows up for them the way she used to, she does not scramble to justify herself. She has nothing to prove. She simply knows that she has outgrown relationships built on imbalance and entitlement. This clarity has made space for new connections that feel reciprocal and nourishing. She has learned that when she honors her boundaries, she attracts people who honor them too. She no longer feels the old anxiety that she must hold everything together to be worthy of love. She no longer measures her value by how much she is willing to endure. She understands that her spirit is her responsibility and protecting it is not selfish, it is essential. There are still times when old habits try to resurface. She notices the familiar urge to explain, to placate, to stay in situations that feel heavy simply because she fears hurting someone's feeling. But she has learned to pause in those moments to ask herself whether keeping the peace is worth the cost of her own well-being. And every time she chooses herself, she no longer sees boundaries as walls, but as gateways. They are the way she tells the world how she expects to be treated. They are the way she preserves her energy for the people and pursuits that bring her joy. They are the way she demonstrates to herself over and over that she is worthy of respect. In the past, she believed that removing people from her life was an act of failure or weakness. Now she knows it is an act of strength. It is evidence of how far she has come, how much she trusts herself to discern what aligns with her spirit and what does not. She understands that not everyone is meant to stay, and that releasing what drains her makes space for what sustains her. She confidently removes anyone who drains her spirit or disrespects her boundaries because she has learned through experience that her peace is too precious to be compromised. She knows that she is responsible for protecting her own well-being, and she will never again abandon herself for the sake of someone else's comfort. Here's a conclusion you can use to wrap up the entire speech. In the end, this is the gift of growing into yourself. You no longer apologize for valuing your peace, your time, and your spirit. You understand that you are not here to please everyone or to carry relationships that drain you. You have earned the wisdom to trust your intuition, the strength to enforce your boundaries, and the courage to walk away from anything that does not honor who you are. You no longer measure your worth by other people's approval because you know that your life is yours to protect and yours to shape. And in choosing yourself without guilt, you give others permission to do the same. This is what freedom looks like. This is what it means to finally stand in your own power